So I've been doing these tours for about, 10 years. They were very popular a few years ago. They're still popular, but not as frequent, mainly because people have this fear of the inner city. There's a tight community in the inner city. Yes, there is crime, but I would say that the crime has definitely gone down. My passion for fabric goes with my passion for Africa. I travel around Africa a lot, and also the Middle East, Asia, India, etc. And I think the reason why I like fabrics is because it's literally the fabric of society. It's something you can bring home, you can package. It's got texture, it's got color. It's something that people use and wear. And I mean, in my case, my whole house is full of it, my cupboards. It's obsession. What I really appreciate is cultural fabric, traditional fabric, fabric that's handmade and of natural fabrics. I don't collect any synthetics. I don't have any synthetic in my house. Even my bucket for washing the kitchen floor is made out of wood. So I'm a bit of a fanatic. No plastic bottles in the house, nothing, only glass. So fabric in Africa is basically the story of colonialism. And the front of the colonial agenda was the missionaries that were sent out. They came to Africa and, it's a long story, but they basically took the land, gave religion, and with the religion, they brought an idea of what's modest and what's acceptable to God or the Bible versus what's not acceptable. So the bare-breastedness of Nguni-speaking people of the southern African area, that was shunned immediately. And the first fabric that came with colonialism was shweshwe. Shweshwe came from Germany, and Northern Europe, and it was traded. They brought in mainly Lutheran missionaries after the Crimean War to the Eastern Cape. That's why you get so many German names of towns. And they were using them as a buffer because they didn't want the Nguni-speaking people that were going south to come towards the Western Cape, which was predominantly white at that stage. Also with Fakane and Shaka absorbing and dispersing tribes at the same time, a lot of people started pushing south, like the Mfengu. Anyway, so the principle was you start trading, then you would start trading in fabrics. In some cases, the fabrics were wanted, like the Basotho blankets, because the Boer farmers had pretty much driven the Basotho people up into the mountains, into Lesotho. And animal hides can provide some protection and warmth, but the Basotho blanket, which was originally a British military blanket, became used, and King Moshoeshoe used that. It was a gift in the beginning, and then he used it as his cultural identity. So the Basotho blanket, you'll see the stripes on it, was actually made for the British Army and then later became absorbed into African culture. Many of the Southern African fabrics followed that trend, like Venda, like Tsonga, and so many others. But I'll get into details later. We are going to explore more we'll do Ethiopian fabrics as well, but the main focus is going to be on what I call the English-speaking colonies. So that's East Africa, Southern Africa, Kenya, those kind of places, Tanzania and so on. And the fabrics were all made either in Asia or in England and then traded in Africa. So what fabric did initially was, firstly, it brought comfort, trade, signs of prosperity. It also brought shame, in the sense that you were shamed if you were not wearing those fabrics that represented modernization. And then what fabric also does is it creates dependency. So the English colonial way of ruling the world was very clever. It was basically like a drug dealer. You create a dependency and then you have a few skirmishes, or you break what they call breaking your bitch in, and which is the wars, divide and rule, and then you create dependency. So what the English would do is they would take cotton from India or Egypt, whatever, take it to Manchester, turn it into fabric, and sell it back to the people. And they did the exact same in Africa, except in Africa they had the fabrics made in India and then traded with the Gujarati community, who were predominantly in the English colonies, directly to the African people. But they invented fabrics so that the fabrics could be done in a distinctly African way. So, for instance, your shuka, which is your tartan of the Swahili coast, or the Maasai as well, that tartan would have originally been Scottish and then brought and turned into a classically Tanzanian, Kenyan, Maasai fabric. The same with Ankara, which came from Batavia. The Dutch brought them across past the Cape to Holland. The Dutch were not mad about the fabric themselves, but along the way in Senegal and Cameroon and those kind of places, the fabric did very well, the batiks from Indonesia. So then Flisco started production of these, made them in a more African in color, more African in design, and then started taking over. But Europe is kind of last year's story. Now it's Asia. So Asia, China in particular, makes those same knockoffs of Flisco, who are making knockoffs of Indonesian fabrics, and it's evolving with people, wearing those kind of fabrics now in West Africa. Good. There's tons more, but I'll just cover it.
Yeah.
Shall we start with this?
But
the nerve of coming and telling you, I'm sorry, you're primitive and barbarian, and I don't like the way you dress, and pray to my God. You've never met my God, but what you do is he's going to save you while we kill you on the background, and then you're going to wear the shit I'm providing you. If that isn't addiction 101.
Yeah.
But what they do in Africa is they also then make the shame cultural, where black people judge other black people as primitive for holding on to their traditions and culture. And that modern, so-called successful America is apparently our savior. Here's the first example of using traditional African design as it was initially, and then using it in a more modern context. So to show you the dress at the back there, that's called imibaka, and that is traditional. That one would probably be Tembu, which is the tribe, the nation that Nelson Mandela belonged to. And his wife, Winnie Mandela, she was Mpondo, but she would have worn something in his culture when they got married, because the woman would adopt the man's nation or tribe. And what it is for me very interesting, because what was called K-sheeting in the old South Africa, is a thick cotton that the British traded originally. It was very strong and powerful. It lasted a long time like denim, but what it was, you'd buy it by the meter and you'd make clothes with it, and then to make the clothes beautiful, or to repair damaged clothes, you would sew on these layers of black fabric. And then also the buttons. The buttons were originally, mother of pearl, that would have come from England with the Cockneys, 1820 settlers, and they started trading. So one of the areas of interest for me in the economics of the contact between African culture and Western culture, or European culture, I'll call it, was the 1820 settlers that were put in as a buffer zone. They were poor whites that were put into Africa. But what I find interesting, because I study a lot around this and I read a lot of history around it, is the amount of missionaries that got here that decided they didn't want to be missionaries anymore. And not because of some religious moment, but the only way you could, as a poor white, get out of Europe was by joining a missionary organization. That was your one-way ticket to a new opportunity, because you grew up in Glasgow cleaning chimneys or whatever the hell, horrific, 18 kids, poverty, industrial revolution. Get to the Cape, come with the Presbyterian missionary organization, and then realize, not really for me. Okay, cheers chaps, I'm going to go and farm, or I'm going to go and trade. And a lot of them became bead traders because it was so lucrative. The beads were made in Venice out of glass and were highly valued in Africa. And then later they came from, after Venice, they started making them in Bohemia in Germany. Well, at some stage it was Czech Republic, then Germany. And that carried on. Nowadays it's mainly made in China, and unfortunately they're really inferior quality today. But Africa had beads long before anybody else. But they would have been made either from seeds or from clay or ostrich eggs, very common. Then about 2,000 years ago, the Arab traders on the East Coast brought glass beads from Iraq, from Raqqa, and they were blue glass. And they were traded in Mopangubwe area. And then much later, the Portuguese started trading carnelian beads that they brought from India for slaves. That was part of the slave trade. So beads was a huge trade even before fabric. But I will explain the various fabrics that came with different people. Yeah. So anyway, in this dress here, which is traditional, and it's made from strips of cloth, as you can see. There's not a lot of sewing involved. With that, the designer here has used the stripes as a barcode, as women's legs, and on all the other dresses, and the whole idea of keeping it African, but suggesting the stripes and modernization. So what Africa does is, Africa is a flavor and a context. It can take anything from anywhere and make it African. That's how I define Africanness. It's a way of seeing the world. It's an element of design. It's a use of color. It's those kind of things. So what's really interesting is, like in Zulu culture, color, for instance, black, represents weddings because of the isidwaba, which is the cowhide from the cow that was sacrificed at the wedding that the bride then wears, and it's black because it's been in the fire. That's how it goes black. Whereas in Zulu culture, white is death, the color of the spirits, the clay. That means death. Sangomas wear white because they speak to the ephemeral spirits. So this fabric it's called the Ankara fabric, and it's from West Africa. But as you can see, the pattern and the batik, or the wax technique, would have been used in Indonesia originally. So by the time it got to Africa, it was traded. The Europeans were not mad about it, not in those days. But the Dutch realized they could make money out of it. So what they did was they created a company called Flisco in Holland, where they could make the more Africanized version of it. So this one is still keeping very much in the traditional Indonesian sort of colors. But as you see, it starts becoming a lot more colorful. This motif is actually stained glass, which is completely European, but it's done in an African context. Others, like this, it has a more sort of, you'll see the batik look, but then it has the sort of modern American pop art design. And then you'll get others that start becoming very much African in nature, like this one is Asuoke, which is a Nigerian print. It's a copy of woven fabric. But now the one that I find interesting is this dress here. This is a voodoo deity who is the trickster. I think his name is Anaki, but he becomes a female deity in New Orleans, And when you wear this dress, it would mean that you're a trickster, mainly for a young girl, because as the spider weaves a web around you and then appears and moves all around, it's a shapeshifter and it moves fast. And it's kind of like, beware. But what is interesting to me is that this print came from West Africa, went to America, has come back to Southern Africa. People like it, but they have no idea what it means. So the whole idea gets completely lost through time. Others do have meaning still. Like this. This here is actually a Japanese print originally, it was printed on ceramics and would have got to America in the 1950s with the occupation of Japan. But it would have been in blue and white. Now it's in yellow and blue, which is more sort of African colors, much brighter. But the kente was for royalty, and it was woven in thin strips out of a combination of silk and cotton. So kente represents royalty. What I find interesting is it's Ashanti originally, and only the royals could afford it and wear it. So it's nobility, and it's a very strong identification with Africa. And I remember a few years ago with the Black Lives Matter movement, they were all wearing those scarves made with this to identify with Africa, which in America, this would represent identifying with Africa, but in Africa, it means Ashanti. So the meaning is changing. Also, I've noticed a lot of like African-American graduates would wear it as a stole at their graduation ceremony. You see, appropriation and appropriateness, let's call it that rather, varies from country to country. So in South Africa, this is completely fine to wear for anybody. But in America, I would say that the African-American community would be offended, some of them, if white people wore this. And in Ghana, if anybody who isn't royal Ashanti, like really. It's like, the Union Jack. It can be used as fabric, it can be used, but I mean, if you're not English, what's the point of wearing it? Although fashion designers will make cushions out of it. There's a lot more freedom in Africa in terms of what's fashionable and what's not. A lot of this refers to different decades. And then the other thing you'll notice, all of these are made in South Africa by South Africans. And look at the sizes. These are for real people. These are not for people with eating disorders that just live on lettuce. These are for customers that already are this size, that are not going to just wear it from the age of 17 till 19 and then never fit into it again. And then all the hats and things also are very much retro, which shows that there's no kind of restrictions. For me, Africa is a very creative space and gets inspired from everywhere. And an image or a design can leave Africa, like the dashiki, go to America and then come back to Africa and become African. So the African identity is a very open topic, what it means to be African. There's that famous expression, it's not about being born in Africa, it's about Africa being born in you. How about you? No, I'm good, thanks. Okay, I brought some people to show them. Thanks. So these are all South African fabrics that are produced, well, the dresses are actually designed and produced in Johannesburg. So a piece like this is quite interesting. This pattern or design and use of color is considered today to be Tsonga or Shangaan, which is northern Limpopo. What's really fascinating is that this pattern was actually created by an Indian merchant. I met his grandson in Makanda in the north. I went to the shop where they actually invented this fabric, and it's based from a 1950s Japanese handkerchief. It's called bucket, most exciting name. But it's considered Tsonga today. Old Tsonga would have been more the Selimpore fabrics, and then of course hides and nakedness, which would have been very traditional. Another Tsonga one, so it's very luminous, bright colors. Here's another one. But if you look at it, you'll see that 50s sort of Japanese handkerchief pattern. What happens with all designs is that with time, the original meaning is lost. Like the English paisley, which is an Indian mango design from Hinduism. Today it's seen as like a symbol for English gentry and, you know, a tie and those kind of things. Its whole meaning has shifted. Another one that was created in at the same place by the same Indian trader is this, which was Venda, the stripes. Today this is considered traditionally Venda. All of them. But the dress is not Venda. So this sort of, what should we call it, an American 50s kind of dress is using Venda fabric that's used for vendors. And even though the design was created by an Indian merchant who was selling to vendors, because it's so strongly identified as Venda, I would actually consider a non-vendor wearing this as slightly offensive because it so strongly identifies as Venda. So it's a little bit like if you are Portuguese and you're wearing a kilt. Like show me your Mackenzie or your McFarlane heritage. However, it's a very gray zone because that same Portuguese person could maybe have a kilt tartan handbag, which I don't think is appropriation. But when you're wearing the full kilt, then I think you are stepping over that mark. It's not a clear-cut pattern. Another one here is stepping over the mark is quite interesting. This pattern is from the southwestern states of America. It's Hopi, Navajo, I don't know exactly which one, but it's put in an African context. Well, this is so far from the Grand Canyon that no one really gives a damn here. It's like when you go to Lagos and see Ndebele prints that are made in China. But I think when you go to Arizona, it would have a different meaning. I think most people that wear this would just like the colors. I don't think they have a clue where it comes from and what it means.
They don't understand the culture.
Not at all. So one of the big inroads to appropriation versus appreciation is understanding context and understanding that a yarmulke generally is worn by Jewish men. So when a French fashion model, you know, is on a ramp wearing a yarmulke, it can be problematic, as well as a nun's habit or anything else, because it has meaning, or a bride's dress. Even in Western culture, there's appropriation amongst each other. Education is a big issue. And then even within a culture, there's ignorance, which becomes, you could say, appropriation. I've seen it in South Africa with young black women from Soweto. They might have a Zulu father and a Sotho mother, whatever, and they'll wear a traditional Zulu isikolo, which is a wedding hat. She's not even married. It's not a fashion statement. It means that you're married. You don't wear a wedding ring if you're not married, I don't think. So this is the dashiki print. And it was originally printed, the whole shirt would have been in this style, and you can see that the dashiki design, which might have originated in India, I'm not sure, because it normally has this trishula, the symbol for Shiva on it. This originated in Nigeria, or was created in Nigeria, this design. It then made its way across in the 70s to America, where the Black Panther movement made it popular, and now it's come back to South Africa. But what's interesting in this is considered South African today, even though the patterns from Nigeria via America back to Africa, the shape of the shirt and the design of the shirt is very much like the East African kurta, which would have been the short shirt with a collar, but this is now completely South African because a lot of South Africans wear it. That's what makes it. it becomes popular. Why is this considered vendor? Because the vendors have decided it's theirs. And a lot of vendors wear it, and the vendors feel that it's their identity. So that's the funny thing about design, color, and meaning. In the old days when I was a kid, red meant you're a communist. Nowadays in America, red means you're a Republican. So that's just a color, it's the color of blood. In Africa, in Southern Africa, red in the Eastern Cape means that you are Amabaka, which means you do not accept Western culture. You follow the blood of the ancestors, whereas blue is the color of Shweshwe, which means that you've become modernized, Christianized, educated at schools, go to university, that type of thing. Another one that I want to show you is this. This is very traditional of West Africa, particularly Senegal, and very much not this particular cut. This is a Western style shirt, but the actual damask fabric, which was originally made in Germany, became very popular there because in Islam, particularly amongst men, modesty meant not too colorful. So they put the design into the shirt without using many colors, which I think is very beautiful. And it's also got a cotton feel to it. Silky cotton, yes. Oh, here we go. So who inspired this shirt? This is clearly Eastern Cape, but you can see there's a hint of it. It's not traditional Xhosa, and yet this pattern, this style, this way of using this heavy white cotton with the black borders is classically Xhosa, or in this case probably Tembu, but the actual shape and cut of the shirt is not, because men don't wear shirts in traditional Xhosa culture. And then this one is modern art. I mean, it is African because it's here in this shop and the design of the dress and so on, but this pattern could belong to any culture. It is not an African design at all. But the colors make it quite African. But they could be European American as well. So what you own is a very complex topic. Here's another one. This is Shweshwe, but it's not real Shweshwe. It's a Chinese copy of a Shweshwe fabric. You can see the sort of Amish kind of Shaker, Lutheran, Protestant design, lack of color, tight little designs, which became distinctly the domestic workers' dress. I mean, this almost looks Amish with the little, or Quaker or Mennonite or one of those. But it's South African now, and Shweshwe is considered very much a South African thing. Its meaning has changed completely. Shweshwe first meant that you'd become a Christian, then it meant that you were a domestic worker, follow the irony, and then in the 80s it meant that you were part of the African struggle of the working class. If you went to Wits University and you were a white professor of, say, sociology wearing Shweshwe, ironically then it meant that you supported the struggle. The concept in the 80s of appropriation did not exist, especially in the revolutionary class. It meant that as a white person wearing African things, you supported the black struggle. Nowadays, it's a fashion statement and its kind of meaning's lost. The only thing that's left about it is that it's South African. But I wouldn't say this represents the working class at all anymore. Not even close. And yet the irony is that a white madam in Bryanston, if she wore this, would be perceived as cultural appropriation, even though it was invented in Europe. But Africa doesn't have the rules of America and Europe. So Africa doesn't really care what you're wearing and so on. They do to a point, but there's a freedom. because we are the oldest continent, but the most young and dynamic at the same time. We've got a lot of room to be creative. I personally find that the old ancient cultures of like Asia and Europe are so calcified and stuck and stale that they don't have a lot of space to express. And then you'll get people like Vivienne Westwood, who is the iconic British designer. And in today's world, she'd be shut down because she's offending people. Offense is what it's all about. She was offended by Margaret Thatcher and the abuse of the Tories. She's represented the working class in the 70s and 80s. So offense is a very bourgeois construct. Quite ironic sort of mannequins, but it's fine, they were cheap. And these show different tribal styles. This one is Zulu, but was created in the 40s and 50s from Indian shops, and all the strips and add-ons that would have been sewn, which from the upcycling point of view is quite interesting. What they did there was they needed to invent clothes, but they only had scraps and cheap bits, and then they would add on everything and make it more and more colorful. So clothing, appearance and identity was very much always part of the African wearing your best, and different clothes for different events and different special ceremonies. So this kind of thing was very much for the young men and for the kids, but today it's used at weddings. So the one time where the modern urban South African does go back to their culture and their traditional clothing is at the time of a wedding. And this shop here, most of these products are made in Durban, and they are sold here by a Nigerian woman who sells it to urban African population that want to reconnect with culture and identity. But now one of the things that's happening today, which I see, is the traditional identity. Obviously a lot of it gets lost. What do? Your mother's Sotho, your father's Zulu. So, I mean, traditionally you'd be Zulu because you adopt the culture of your father, but when you have a wedding, you kind of have an overlap. And what's happening is they're creating a new South African identity. So you'll have, say, Ndebele beadwork, a Basotho blanket, and a Zulu skirt. Which for a traditionalist is problematic, but it's where the world's going. So all the things in this shop are sold as accessories for weddings. This is tsonga, which is beadwork that's put around the hips to accentuate the hips. Here you can see the shabalani, which is the traditional dress. This fabric actually came from India like 400 years ago, from Selimpur, and then the brocade is added on. There's about 17 meters of fabric. It's heavy, but the whole point of it is to accentuate the hips and the fecundity of the young maiden. This one is Ndebele and Zulu. There's a kind of an overlap going on here. So the pattern is Ndebele, but it's not a traditional Ndebele. So there's a kind of mixture. I mean, here's another classic mixture of the Xhosa with the Ndebele pattern, but the Zulu beads on the side. These necklaces, this one just is distinctly ANC in colors. These are sort of Xhosa colors, but the golwani or the necklace is Ndebele. So you can see people are creating their own styles inspired from different traditions. At the back here, you have the isikolo, which is distinctly Zulu. These are the modern ones that are worn for weddings or for special functions. Very much a design point of view, but this is not your traditional one. Your traditional one would have been red and would have been made a basket frame, which you weave your hair into once you get married, and you never cut your hair until your husband dies. And now they use the same basket, but they don't use the traditional actual hair. They would make it out of cloth. And then you get all the bright colors and the variations, but the design is traditionally Zulu. So one of the things that I find very interesting about, let's say not interesting, but problematic with the Western romance of tribal culture, particularly amongst women, is they want to walk around in all these fabulous designs and things. But a lot of the culture is actually about oppression. It's like, get pregnant, be pregnant. I'm not saying pregnancy is oppression, but there's a lot of women know your place, which is very tribal in all tribes of the world. So they'll wear all this heavy jewelry, but the irony that they're not seeing is that as a Western woman, you have the right to take that jewelry off whenever you choose. And yes, it's beautiful, but for some people it's quite heavy. It's not always, fun and fantasy. Like for instance this. Well, we got another one over here. Let's find one. Have you got the other one of these? Then I can show them. Here we go. Here it is, thanks. These are vendor, and these are worn by young women before they get married, and they throw it on the back and wear it at the back, and it represents flowers and pollination and fertility and me the flower, you the bee. Do the picture. This one is worn mainly by Ndebele. It's a pattern that's very much more African. I'm not sure exactly its origin, but I know they call this the Sangoma blanket. But it's for marriage in the Ndebele tradition, and is very much more African. See? What is the fabric? Okay, so originally it would have been made out of wool. Nowadays it's a mix, which I prefer because the moths don't eat it. So having authentic wool is not always great. I love real wool, but not when I'm living in Joburg, thanks very much. There's nothing more depressing than waking up one day and all your stuff's been eaten and you've got to toss it and not happy. Here's another one. If you can see there. Thank you. This one, so here's one that is distinctly appropriation. This one is called Abakweta, and it's from the Eastern Cape. It's Xhosa, and young men wear this when they go in for initiation. So this kind of specific cultural and religious detail, if you wear this, it's definitely appropriation. It's not a white blanket with a black stripe. Yes, Abakweta. So you can see how things evolve. I mean, look at how the Xhosa, the black and white dress has done a complete 360. So the hat is quite Ndebele, then the neck ring is Ndebele, the pattern, the white fabric has now become black, and the borderline, which is black, has become white. So it's done a whole thing, but you can still see elements of it. Other pieces like this is 100% Xhosa. Men wear this. When I say Xhosa, I mean isiXhosa speaking people. There are about 8 different nations in the Eastern Cape that are not Xhosa. They all speak Xhosa language. It's like Americans speak English, but they're not English. There's like Mpondos and Mfengus, Bomvanas. They all speak the isiXhosa language, but they're not Xhosa. And they are Swazi and Zulu. This one is Swazi because of the pattern. And these normally would have been worn by, this one is a Zulu pattern. They would have been worn by young fiancés, the male and the female. And it's kind of a betrothal thing. They're not married yet, but it represents, you know, she's taken.
But like an engagement ring.
Yeah, but it's more clear than that. Like, don't even hit on him, that's mine. Now, the irony is that you buy the whole dress like this. Traditionally, the women would have got just the fabric and sewn it on themselves, the black layers and layers of it, and all the buttons. But these are plastic buttons. They would have got the buttons from the 1820 settlers trading, the mother of pearl specifically, that they've been trading for about 200 years. It's been kind of turned into a dress which is not traditionally Xhosa at all. In the Xhosa tradition, they would have had a wrap and then a breast cover and then a shawl. That's it. Not stitched like this, no. So another thing that you'll notice with traditional culture is because they would buy by the meter and have fabric that they then wear, they would not stitch it into a shape. Because what happens if you get pregnant? What happens if you put on weight? You have to use the same pieces of cloth, like your kapulana in East Africa or your kitenga fabric in Malawi. You need to reinvent it as your body shape changes. So in modern Western culture, you just buy another outfit. And that's one of the reasons why people throw stuff away, is when they get pregnant or their shape changes or they get fatter or whatever.
Fashion changes.
Or fashion changes as well. It's the whole idea of the fabric is to dispose of it, not to keep it going. So in the old African culture, you would have one fabric and then that's your life, you wear it.
And it came down to economics.
Yeah, but it's also pride and effort. It's more like a uniform. And you'd have some for going to church and others for getting married and so on. And then you keep it. You don't toss it. Okay. Stick. Exactly. So at the back of this shop, it's owned by Nigerians, but you normally have the tailors that are from Ghana, and then they will create all of these clothes that are made here. The borderlines, the hems, the shoulders, as you can see, the cape, whatever, all from off-cut fabrics. And then they make it as they go along.
So they don't wear pattern?
No, from your head. So even the embroidery is done from their head. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing this all day, every day, you get good at it. So all of this, they're not busy now, but you can see that they'll take bought fabric and then they'll make different things with it. And then they'll get patterns and reinvent them. And it's all made to size. So unlike Western culture where you are a size whatever and you walk in and the mannequin's wearing it and you lose another 10 kilos so you can fit into it, it's not like that at all. You come here, whatever your shape, size and form, and then they will either, what I do is I normally bring a shirt that I know already fits comfortably and they just replicate it, or they will, you know, measure you and make it like that, tailored. Which I've noticed in modern consumer culture is kind of history. The whole tailoring idea is dead.
But here you would go to Woolies and pick from a rack of...
Yeah, and it's all made in China by children and whatever.
Some of it doesn't quite work.
Exactly. And then you've got to keep up with the Joneses. And it's by the kilogram.
Okay, they sell it by the kilogram.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's 10 Rand or something.
Oh, amazing.
Not sure what exactly they do with it, but there's no one here now, but they do know. You can ask the guy at the front.
Okay.
Yeah.
And sell it by the kilogram makes sense. Somebody can use it.
Oh yes, lots of people want it. And it's more colorful and you can be more creative. The thing I find the most depressing about buying off the shelf, or let's say off the mannequin, is there's no creativity, no fun.
And you're being forced to in somebody else's idea.
Exactly, which doesn't exactly fit either. Or you create a fashion out of uncomfortable, which is insane.
Especially when your body size doesn't fit.
Well, they always talk about oppression of women. Like, what's the bigger oppression, wearing an apron or lying on your bed and forcing a pair of jeans on to keep men happy? Sick. This shop supplies all the traditional products that are used for weddings or the accessories. This is now considered classically Ndebele, even though somebody must have created that pattern at some stage to call it Ndebele. And what they do now is they take fabrics these were made in India, but these are symbols for sangomas. What they're doing today is that they are taking them and making hats out of them, out of the sangoma fabric. And they're busy making backpacks, like you can see behind there. And some of these fabrics are actually very old. So these two styles of fabric, this one is originally from India, which would have been Bengali, a lungi pattern. And then this one is Ndao, which is it's about 400 years old in trading, and it's Arabic in origin. The Tsongas would have traded, because the Tsongas started trading in Mozambique with the Arabs, and then they brought a lot of these ideas to Zimbabwe, northern South Africa, those areas. So here you have all the different types of fabrics. And what's really interesting is when you see how a pattern changes over time in meaning, like your Hawaiian pineapple pattern is now Tsonga, and the Sangoma fabric here has got the American eagle in it. Like, don't ask me how that happened. And then you got your DA fabric there.
Couldn't find the guinea fowl.
And there's a guinea fowl there, which is classically South African, very much so. So here you can see how they've reinvented the Xhosa fabrics for traditional wear. This is very much traditional. And then the bag, and then the wraps. So that is a classic Tembu style with just a wrap and then the shoulder cover. And then this is a copy of Isidwaba, which is Zulu, which would have represented marriage. But it's not real leather anymore. And traditionally you would have had to wear the leather from the actual ceremony. A lot of the Zulu men started making shoes out of tires, where you'd carve it and cut it with patterns, and it's all reinvented tires that are used because they're strong, and you want a product that can last a long time. And I think that's one of the problems today with the upcycling world, is that where do you find something strong other than denim? Denim's like the only thing that's really carried through. All the tight, strong cottons, when you've got some crappy synthetic thing, what can you do with it? So what he does is these are all sewing machines. And these are sewing machines, and what you'll notice with all of them is almost entirely not made in Asia. They're mainly European and American made. Old brands that go back some up to 100 years. And the reason why the tailors prefer them is because they're easy to fix and they last a lifetime. And if you zoom in, you'll see they've got like Singer and Bernina and all the old ones. None of them are made in Asia. No new ones. The tailors don't want new machines because they don't last more than 3 or 4 years. And they want a simple design that you can work with. To hell with all the fancy gadgets. A lot of religions will use their fabrics again.
Yes.
Like the Orthodox Jews.
Yes.
because what happens is they have lots of children and then they hand down the clothes, you know, as the kids go along, and they adjust them, and then because the cotton is so expensive and they don't have a lot of money, they will reinvent the clothing for each generation. That I've definitely seen. In fact, religious cultures, I'm talking old traditional religious cultures, are much less likely to buy new. They would rather use what they've got. And then what's also interesting, semi-problematic, is in the tribal African culture, the young bride will usually have new outfit. She doesn't want to have her mother's dress. But what will be passed down are the beads. So even though the beads have been sewn in a specific way, because beads are valuable, the beads are not always buried with the deceased. They are restitched and reused. And there's one particular cultural item that the Tsongas use, where they use it's a small copper pipe that they weave into the what do you call it, like the belt of a married woman, and it's given to young girls as well, and it's copper that they put in water when a girl has her first menstrual cycle, has some reaction, whatever, and then that gets given from the grandmother to the daughter to the daughter's daughter, and it's the lineage of fertility, which is very traditional. Yeah, here you can see the different cultures, like the very much the modern Western style, the traditional ones, and then this is Nigerian style with the very sort of shiny. This one is distinctly Indian in origin, you can see, and yet it's considered Nigerian today. This one as well, appropriation. The key word is like, appreciation. All of this leather, you can see, is Nguni cow, kudu. How much is this one? Do you know? The cow, the Nguni. This is a very good price, 2,800. And these pieces are so cheap. And then of course you got all your leftovers that you can buy for next to nothing, I'm sure. Came with the missionaries, and then it became very much African. What you'll notice though is that the colors of shweshwe have moved away from the boring sort of blues and browns. Those colors were used, the blue was used for religious reasons, and the brown was for practical reasons, for dirt, you know, for cleaning up, and you didn't have to buy the domestic worker a new outfit every month, whatever, while she's on her hands and knees polishing madam's floors. Later, it got a much looser, more colorful feel, which is where it's at today. These were originally made in Europe, as I say, and then in 1948 they started making them in basically King Williamstown area. And we were the first country to own our own fabrics in terms of making traditional fabrics for ourselves, not importing. King Williamstown's also where Steve Biko comes from, and it was very much on the crossroads between the Transkei and the Ciskei and the Eastern Cape in those days. So it was a very big and very popular fabric. Now it's throughout South Africa. This is one of the oldest haberdasheries in Johannesburg, and this is heaven for anybody who makes their own clothes or anything to do with fabrics. They don't sell used fabrics here, but they do sell fabrics from Western, modern, also plenty of fabrics that are African as well. So I'll show you some of the old pieces. Most of these are Singer, and these were mainly made in Germany. The quality of the European machines was far superior to the new Asian ones in terms of hardiness and lasting a lifetime. And you can see the old machines there. And it's not unusual to find Ghanaian tailors in Joburg still using machines that are over 100 years old. These are hat stretching apparatus. And here's one for the felt hat. That hats were very popular in the West until about the 60s. Men all wore hats. So the concept of the Mad Hatter comes from here because it was made out of lead and the felt was pressed with heat into this. And then of course the hat maker would have tested the hats and all the lead would have gone into his brain and made him insane. So that's where the Mad Hatter idea comes from. He was mad as a hatter. But what's really interesting when you look at the fabric and textile world, it was predominantly European until the Second World War. Then it was predominantly American until about the 90s. And now it's predominantly Chinese. So each phase, even these German needles. So I would any day, from an aesthetic point of view, buy an old anything, even a toaster, and have it fixed because of workmanship and detail. This is magnificent. It's a piece of art. A modern sewing machine is white plastic from China. It's going to last you 3 years. It's going to break. It's a piece of shit. This will last you a lifetime. Your children's children will use it. Also with fabric, what I noticed is the detail that I crave is all about time. People had time. Time wasn't you could spend a month working on one item and the love would go into it for your children or for your daughter-in-law or whatever. I mean, I see it with African beadwork. You see African beadwork and you see the hours. And because I do beadwork myself and I repair a lot of old pieces, respect and skill and knowledge and mathematics. And let's say women in rural areas that couldn't read and write in a Western understanding, but they have the most incredible knowledge of maths and science in terms of making the beads, positions and techniques, and they didn't have paper to write all these combinations down, and they just do this mind-blowing stuff. So this is shwe shwe, but this is modern shwe shwe. So you can see it's real shwe shwe because of the smell. First thing you do is you smell it, and it has that smell of the chemical that they used on the boats when they brought it from Europe so that it wouldn't rot. Then they started making South Africa. People didn't want to buy it because it didn't have the smell that they were familiar with. So they kept the chemicals. So this means that it's printed in South Africa. You can also feel that it's thick. It's made from pure cotton and it's very starched, so you have to leave it in salt water for a while. But what you'll see is that the old shwe shwe patterns of the blue and white, the sort of very dull domestic worker style they've kind of died out. And now you get, even this, you can see it's modern. And then, I mean, you're getting like your beiges and your all different types. I mean, I understand that shwe shwe is South African, but it's got a history of blood, and it's not, I don't see it as pretty anymore. I see it as quite oppressive. But I do understand that you can take it and make it your own. And it's still South African identity. It's got nothing to do with Europe anymore. Also, you'll notice that the patterns are becoming a lot looser.
Yes.
They're breaking away from that sort of Protestant mold. And the colors are becoming Mexican, Catholic, happy, wilds, Frida Kahlo. This is Basan, which is damask, which is from Senegal. And it's cotton, but it's got like a silk feel to it. It's amazing. How much is your Basan? Okay, like $60 and you get the most incredible colors with the patterns inside. It's starched, so you have to add salt water to it, and then it washes out and goes soft. Obviously, you can't print fabrics on soft cloth. That's why it's starched. This is, let's see what they call it nowadays. What is this one called nowadays? This is the Koza one, yeah. So you call it imbako. What they used to call K-sheeting when I was a child. And it's the kind of thing that once you've used it as a dress, whatever, it gets softer with each year. but then you can reinvent it into bedding, handbags. And that's not my new idea. That's been done for decades. So during COVID, we had lockdown all the time. I miss COVID terribly because I loved lockdown. So I would read, I would spend time with my cats, but most of the time I would spend beading and working by hand. Because when you are stitching, whether it's crochet, knitting, beading, carpentry, whatever, you are not in your mind anymore. You are present. You're focused, it's meditation, it's reward, and it's time, and it's joy. And you don't see it as how much I'm getting paid per hour. So these are quite interesting because these are copies that are probably made in China, but this is an Ndebele pattern. So Ndebele culture will never wear this. This is actually the walls that are painted in this style. But now it's become a pattern because it is South African. Yes, it's Ndebele, but I mean, you'll see, if you go to Lagos, Nigeria, you'll see people with this fabric. This one is the samakaka, which is a traditional Angolan fabric as well. You can see the style is quite different. So some of the fabrics are imaginary hocus pocus, and then others are very much traditional African. Some are West African and some are just modern patterns, traditional tribal stuff, all kinds of things here. I'll show you some of the classics like this one. So these are the West African ones, and these are pure cotton. You can feel the quality's much thicker and much better. And a lot of them represent desires. So this is to travel. This was popular during COVID. Everybody was buying, let's get on an airplane and get out of here. And then it's got the time in different countries. Lagos, New York, London, and Paris. It's kind of wild though because it's back to front, but anyway. And then other ones, this is scary. This is like an idea of Africa, but it's so not Africa. That's like tourist Africa. This is tourist Rastafarian. This is real Africa. So this pattern is the secretary bird from Uganda, and this pattern you'll find in Central Africa a lot. And it's pure cotton, it's very good quality. So when I buy fabric, I first go for thickness, then I go for real cotton, and then finally I go for detail, for print. How well printed is it? How good is the dye? Does the dye run? And this you can see is a very good print because it's got detail. This one you can see is not a great print. It's not of the same quality at all. This is a much better quality. Things change and how things fly away. The window that's open and then the goose flying away. Often they're messages that women would wear in their fabrics so that people would understand, like she's not interested in a relationship where you just fly out the window. She's serious, she means business. This one is about wealth and aspiration. The person who wears this probably doesn't have a car, but would like a car and sees, you know, that wealth is owning a car. The same here with going traveling. I go to Limpopo a lot and I love the Tsonga, their appreciation of color, and I love their beadwork. Yeah, I'm mad about the Tsongas. These are originals, and don't date your age, but this is from the 90s and the 80s.
Yes.
And you just know that it's real. You see? So basically, the area we're in now is the Ethiopian area. It's always been an area of immigrants. Before Ethiopian, it was Portuguese that came here after the liberation of Angola and Mozambique. They came to live in this area. Now, most of them have either moved back to Portugal or they moved to Rosettenville and those kind of areas. This strip here these are Congolese women that are selling fish and food for the guys that are working, and they work all along this road to the taxi rank on North Street. and then the other one is in the south. So all the domestic workers and people that are, you know, working in the north that live in Soweto, they would come and walk through here. So all of this is on consignment, and these are mainly West Africans selling to South Africans the same things that you can buy at all the department stores for a quarter of the price. It was quite popular in the 60s in Johannesburg to decorate buildings with famous artists. I remember Hyde Park had some mosaic as well. And this was the medical and dental building where white people came to see the dentist on a Saturday morning and the doctors. It's still called a medical building, but what is ironic for me is that she did this beautiful mosaic, and it's got an Ndebele woman and an Indian woman and I think Xhosa, well, her idea of Xhosa, and crocodiles and a marketplace with chickens and garlic and chilies. Little did she know that this is what it would become. So yeah, but it's very beautiful. In the Ethiopian Orthodox, they don't depict the angels as having bodies. They're just faces with wings, and all the faces look the same. So it's no longer idolatry when everybody looks the same. So this is hand-woven natural fabric, pure cotton from Ethiopia. And I've seen this almost identical fabric at the Nubian Museum in southern Egypt. And this fabric was woven in Africa for the last 7,000 years. So this predates any European fabric, okay, and it's extremely detailed and fine. This is the kind of fabric that Cleopatra, Nefertiti, all the pharaohs, etc. would have been wearing. It's magnificent and it's incredibly skilled. But the loom is small, so they sew them together in panels. And then you've got another thicker one, this one here, which is gabe, and this one is used by the shepherds